Hi, so in this video I want to talk quickly about Base64 encoding and decoding. There are many situations where we have to deal with Base64 encoded data. Very often, if you're working, let's say, with APIs, you may have to provide or receive tokens that have been Base64 encoded. So using Python, this is actually very straightforward. The only thing is that the Base64 encoding functions in Python work on bytes or byte arrays or bytes, instances of the bytes class, not strings directly. So the first thing we'll likely need to do is to encode our strings to bytes and, to do the Base64 encoding of a string. And then on the reverse side, we'll have to decode the bytes that we get from a Base64 decoding back to a string. Now in Python, strings are basically sequences of Unicode code points, and the string class actually provides an encode method that can be used. So for example, if I have this string here, so this is just a regular string, ye old cheese shop, and I can now encode it. And I can use different encodings. We have things like, for example, ASCII, so we can encode in ASCII. This will encode it to ASCII characters, and this works because all of these are indeed ASCII characters. But we could also encode to things like UTF-8, and then you have other encodings as well, UTF-16 and so on, and Python supports a variety of those. Now you'll see what comes back when we encode. It looks like a string, but you have this B prefix, and in fact what we have is an instance of the bytes class, and that's what we want. So if we look at the actual type of that, you'll see that the type is bytes. Now, the two encodings here with ASCII and UTF kind of look the same because, well, those are all ASCII characters. There's nothing really special about them. So let's go ahead and actually bring in some more kind of extended character sets. Let's take this emoji over here. So that's my string. Now, Python 3 works with UTF-8 in strings by default, and this is why we can basically just put in, something like that. So we can now encode this into, let's say, a UTF-8 encoding. So we just have to basically repeat what I have over here, and we can encode it. And now you can see it looks a little bit different, right? So we've got this byte array, essentially, this byte string. And then we have these characters here, \x f0, \x 9f, and so on. And I have a video on Unicode in this channel as well, so you can take a look at that if you don't know what all these characters are. Now, of course, because of this character here, an ASCII encoding is not going to work. If I try and encode using ASCII characters, or say specifying that my encoding is ASCII, that is not going to work because the ASCII codec cannot encode this funky character here. All right, so very often we use UTF-8, but depending on your application, you may have other encodings that you may be forced to use. By default, I tend to use UTF-8, but depending on your particular problem you're working on, you'll have to use maybe different encodings. So now that we have this byte array, we can convert it back to a string, and byte arrays have a decode method that you can use on byte arrays. So let's just go ahead and create a variable called encoded equals s.encode, and then we'll encode using UTF-8. So if we look at, and I don't think the underscore works. So UTF-8, and if we look at what that is, that's the string that we had just now. And that is, well, the byte string, right? So now we can take this encoded, this bytes object, and we can decode it. And of course, here, if we try and do ASCII, that's not going to work because we have a character here that it can't decode, right? These things are not ASCII characters. So we can, however, decode them using UTF-8 since we encoded the string using UTF-8. So if we do that, we get our string back. Okay, so that's the thing with encode and decode. That's how we can go back and forth from strings to bytes. So the next step now is to actually do the Base64 encoding of a string, which is what we're looking at. And for that, we're going to use the Base64 module. So we're going to import the Base64 module. Now, the functions that we have in here, there's two basic ones. One is called B64 encode, and the other one is B64 decode. But those don't work on strings, they work on bytes. So let's go ahead and see what our string S is. It's this one over here. So to do the base64 encoding of this string, we first have to basically transform it into a bytes array. So UTF-8 like so, and then base64 encoded. I'll create this as a variable. I'm going to use the base64 modules B64 encode. That's the function we want to use, and we're going to use the encoded, the bytes basically, and then we can just take a look at what that is. So base64 encoded, and if we take a look at that, we can see now that we have this base64 encoded byte array, right? This bytes string, this byte string. So if we want to now transform that back to a string, well, that's very straightforward. We basically take this and then we're going to decode it, and we're going to use UTF-8. And so we get that. This is our base64 encoding using UTF-8 of this particular string. Now to decode a base64 encoded string, to decode this basically, we just need to reverse the process. So first we'll need to encode the string here into a byte string. Then we'll need to base64 decode it. And then if we want the result back as a string, then we're going to have to encode the result back to a string. So let's start with this. So I'm going to take this string portion over here. Those are bytes, but it's actually coming in as a string. So this is actually a string, as you might get back, let's say, from an API request, for example. You wouldn't get a bytes array back, you would actually get a string back. So this is our string. So the first step we need to do is to encode it. So we can say encoded equals b.encode, and we are going to use UTF-8 over here. And then I'm going to say base64 is equal to base64 dot B64 decode. So now I'm using the B64 decode function in the base64 module. We're going to pass it our encoded bytes string, and then we're going to say our result. So B64, remember, is going to be what? It's going to be a byte array, right? Let's just take a look. You can see we've got this byte, this B over here. So what really we want to do, we want to say result equals B64 dot encode, decode, right? We want to decode that byte array back to a string. And we're going to use UTF-8 codec. And if we look at that, then we actually get our UTF-8 string back. Now, there's one thing to know about decoding base64 encoded strings. The encoded string length should technically be a multiple of 4. And Python does this for us. Let's take a look. I'm just going to copy paste this from the notebook that's available in the repo that's linked below this video. So you can see I have different length strings, and I'm going to encode each one of them using UTF-8. And I can go ahead now and print, and I'm going to print the encoding, and I'm going to print the length of the encoding. So if we take a look at that, you'll notice that we have, 24, 32, 36, and 40. And you'll notice that sometimes you get these equal signs over here, and sometimes you don't. Well, what happens is that the actual base64 encoded string is just this. These two equal signs are basically used as padding characters. They're like, you can think of them as null characters in base64, but they're equal signs. And they're used to get a multiple of 4 on each of the strings. So if the string is already of length, or the byte array is already of length 24, of a length of multiples of 4, you don't need to do any padding. Here, this would be a length of 30, and so that needs to be brought up to a multiple of 4, so we add 2 equal signs. Here, the actual length of the encoding would be 35, and to get it to this multiple of 4, we would have to go up to 36. 4 times 9 is 36, right? And then 40 is already a multiple of 4. So Python takes care of that padding for us, and that's usually how base64 has to be done. However, not all systems actually put this padding in for us. So and that happens a lot with API tokens. You'll get an API token back that's been Base64 encoded, but it hasn't gotten, it hasn't put in the actual padding here to get a multiple of 4. And the problem is that if we take this, let's say I take this over here, and I'm going to create this string, right? So now I've got s equals, and then it'll just be that string over here. If we try and decode that string, we're going to get an exception. So let's try that. Let's go ahead and we'll say base64.b64 decode. Now we cannot decode the string, we have to convert it. So we'll encode it to UTF-8. And so we get this error, right? We get this incorrect padding. That's because when this string over here that was supposed to be this representation, right, doesn't have the padding in place. So what we can do, however, that's easy to fix, and we can do it this way. So we can go ahead and again, I have that string. Let me just copy the string back down here so we have everything together like so. And then I'm going to encode it so I can convert my string to bytes. So I'm going to encode, and I'm going to use the UTF-8 codec again, as usual. And then what I'm going to do with the encoded is I'm going to add a equal sign. I'm going to add the padding manually. Now I'm adding a byte, right? This is a byte. These are bytes. This is a byte array. So I need to make sure I add bytes onto that. If you try and put it as a string, that's not going to work. So technically I need 2, right? If you remember the original one that Python encoded for us, Base64 encoded, there were 2 equal signs for the padding because otherwise we would only have 30 characters. So I'm only going to do 1 here, and then I'm going to do the same rigmarole. I'm going to Base64 B64 decode. We'll take encoded, and then the result of that, which is now the decoded Base64 string, I want to actually decode that back to a string. So I use the decode UTF-8. But watch what happens. Again, I get the error that I have the incorrect padding. And yes, that's because I actually need the 2 characters, right? I need to pad with 2 more characters. And now you can see the problem has been fixed. Now, what's interesting with this padding character is that if you put too many, Python doesn't care. As long as you have at least the number needed to get to a multiple of 4, everything else after that, basically it's just like adding another null character. It doesn't care. So what this means is that in general, we can just add 3 equal signs always to the encoding and then guarantee, therefore, that this is always going to work no matter what. So given all this, let's go ahead and write some functions to Base64 encode and decode strings in a reliable manner. So the first one, we're going to say def encode, s is going to be a string, and I will allow users to pass in a custom encoding if they want, but we'll default it to UTF-8. And then encoded, and I could really, do the whole operation on one line, but I'll break it up into separate steps so we can see what's going on. So we're going to take our string, we're going to encode it using whatever the encoding is. Then we need to do the Base64 encoding. So we'll call it Base64 encoded, and that's going to be equal to Base64.b64 encode, and we'll pass it the bytes encoded. And then we're going to return, I want a string, so maybe I should also put the output here. I'll put the type hint for the return value. So that's going to be a string as well. And we're going to return Base64 encoded, and we're going to decode it using that encoding that we provided as an argument, like so. So that's the encoding function. We don't have to worry about padding here because Python automatically pads that string that we have, that we get back from the encoding. The decoding is where we have to worry about that. So let's go ahead and write the decode function. Again, it's going to be taking a string. There's going to be an encoding, which we will default to UTF-8. and then the return again is going to be a string. So this is for encoding and decoding strings. And we're going to say encoded. Again, we have to convert our string S to an encoded bytes, right? We have to encode it essentially to get the bytes. So we'll use the encoding. Then the Base64 decoded is equal to the Base64.B64 decode. Now I cannot just pass in encoded because I have this problem with the padding. So I'm going to pass encoded plus, and since it doesn't matter if we have too many of these equal signs, I'll pass 3 of them in. This way I'm guaranteed that I at least have, the number required to get a multiple of 4. And now that that's done, now I can go ahead and return B64 decoded, and then we'll decode using the encoding to get a string back, like so. And so these are my encode and decode functions. So we can test it out. We can take the decode that we had before, that string that we had. Remember, it's missing the padding. So if we decode that, that works just fine. And we can encode a string. So if I encode that, this is the encoding. You'll notice that there is some padding here. If I was to put 2 more characters, then you'd see that we don't have the padding anymore. Okay, so we have that. Then we can actually decode and encode at the same time. So I'm going to decode what I've encoded, right? So that should work. And we get our string back as it was. And that's it for Base64 encoding and decoding. It's pretty straightforward. You just have to remember that those functions only work with bytes objects. And you also have to worry about the padding in case you're being passed a Base64 encoded string that is missing its padding in order to get to a multiple of 4. Thanks for watching.